When a weary volunteer sneered, "Here to pose for charity photos, Mr. Hollywood," the entire camp held its breath. Keanu Reeves didn't argue, didn't walk away. Instead, he opened a guitar case. What followed in that smoke-filled shelter would silence every doubt and change a broken community forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The smoke hung low over the valley, a heavy blanket that blurred the edges of everything. The sun was still up there somewhere, but it was reduced to a pale orange disk, faint and ghostly through the haze. Ash drifted like snowflakes that nobody wanted. Northern California had been burning for days, and now this small-town high school gymnasium had become a lifeline for hundreds of people with nowhere else to go. Inside, the smell of sweat, smoke, and fear mixed together. Rows of cots stretched across the basketball court, where families sat in silence or tried to entertain restless children. A few toddlers clutched stuffed animals that smelled faintly of the homes they had been forced to leave behind. Their parents kept glancing at the doors, as if half expecting to hear news that the fire had taken more. The sound of shuffling feet, muffled sobs, and the constant barking of orders from overworked volunteers filled the space. At one end of the gym, boxes of bottled water were stacked like bricks. Volunteers in yellow vests moved back and forth, handing out blankets, sandwiches, and small comfort items. They looked tired, their eyes rimmed red not only from smoke, but from sheer exhaustion. Many of them had been working non-stop for days, barely sleeping, trying to stretch limited supplies across too many hungry mouths. Into this scene, without fanfare, a man walked through the main doors. His jeans were worn but sturdy, his boots dusted with ash, and a dark baseball cap was pulled low over his brow. There was no entourage, no cameras, no assistants carrying bags. Just him, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as if he wanted to pass unnoticed. But in a place where monotony had dulled everything, recognition spread quickly. Whispers darted from cot to cot. Mothers leaned close to one another. Teenagers nudged each other, eyes widening. A boy of about 12 tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing discreetly. It was him. It was Keanu Reeves. For a moment, disbelief mingled with curiosity. Some evacuees craned their necks for a better look, while others squinted as if doubting their own eyes. Why would a Hollywood star show up here, in this smoke-choked gym far from Los Angeles? Surely he had safer places to be, more glamorous commitments than standing in line for a paper wristband that volunteers tied around newcomers' arms. Keanu gave a nod to the volunteer at the desk, murmuring his name as quietly as possible. The young man on duty blinked twice, hesitating, then scribbled it down without comment. The star didn't ask for special treatment, didn't wave away the standard procedure. He simply accepted the wristband, adjusted his cap, and moved aside to let the next weary evacuee step forward. All around, suspicion grew. A woman, holding her baby, clutched the child tighter, whispering to the man beside her, wondering if he was here for publicity. An older man shook his head, muttering under his breath that actors only showed up when cameras were around. A few teenagers pulled out phones, but one look at Keanu's expression, calm, steady, intent on keeping the moment private, made them slip the devices back into their pockets. The gym was no stranger to tension. Evacuees already carried the raw edge of loss, the fear of the unknown, and now the sudden presence of a celebrity brought an unfamiliar kind of unease. Whispers hardened into doubts. Could this really be about helping? Or was it just another story for the tabloids? Yet Keanu moved with the same steady rhythm as anyone else. He adjusted the strap of a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, waited in line for supplies, and when a child dropped a juice box, he bent to pick it up and placed it back into the small hands without a word. The boy's mother blinked, startled by the simple gesture, and muttered a soft "thank you." Keanu only nodded and moved on, heading toward the cots at the far end of the gym. The whispers followed him like shadows, growing louder each step he took. Recognition was undeniable now. Yet alongside curiosity, there was skepticism, as if the presence of a famous face couldn't possibly belong to this place of smoke, sweat, and fear. The murmur spread until the entire gym seemed to vibrate with quiet speculation. Parents whispered to one another, children peeked from behind their blankets, and even the volunteers exchanged uncertain glances. His presence was undeniable, and it unsettled the fragile balance of the room. At one corner, a teenage girl sat cross-legged on a cot, sketching in a notebook she had carried out of her burning home. She lifted her head and stared openly at the newcomer, her pencil frozen mid-stroke. Beside her, her younger brother asked in a hushed voice if it was really that guy from the movies. The girl only nodded, eyes wide, unable to believe what she was seeing. Near the supply tables, one of the older volunteers leaned against a stack of boxes, crossing his arms. His gaze followed Keanu, hard and skeptical. The man had spent the past week working 16-hour shifts, watching people arrive in tears, listening to their stories of loss. He muttered under his breath to another worker that celebrities only came when there were cameras. The other worker shrugged, too tired to argue, but the comment traveled. Soon, several evacuees were looking at Keanu differently, some curious, some resentful. Keanu, however, seemed unaffected by the sadder, shifting atmosphere. He placed his duffel bag on the floor near an empty cot and quietly helped a mother lift her daughter's suitcase onto the bed beside her. He spoke softly, his voice calm, asking if she needed anything else. She shook her head, still processing the surreal fact that the man helping her was a world-famous actor. He gave her a gentle nod and stepped away, never pausing long enough to invite praise. The gym doors opened again, letting in another gust of smoky air, and a group of new evacuees stumbled inside, coughing and weary. Without hesitation, Keanu moved toward them. He picked up a box of bottled water from the nearest stack, carried it across the floor, and set it down where the newcomers could easily reach it. Then he guided an elderly man who was struggling with his cane toward an open chair. The old man's hands trembled as he sat, whispering a raspy thank you. Keanu clasped his shoulder briefly, steadying him, then returned to help others. Watching from her cot, a mother with 2 children whispered to another parent that perhaps he was different from what the rumors suggested. She had noticed how naturally he moved, how he blended into the rhythm of the volunteers instead of drawing attention to himself. The other parent nodded reluctantly, though doubt still clouded his face. Across the gym, the skeptical volunteer shook his head again, but even he couldn't deny the quiet way the stranger had stepped into the flow of work. His suspicion remained, though. Why would someone like Keanu Reeves, who could be anywhere in the world, choose to be here in a smoky gym handing out water bottles? The night outside grew darker, the fire's glow faint but constant on the horizon. Inside the gym, suspicion still lingered, wrapping around the evacuees like the smoke that crept through the cracks of the building. Keanu, silent and steady, continued moving among them, unaware that every step was being watched, measured, and judged. The gymnasium lights flickered under the strain of the old electrical system. A generator hummed outside, unreliable but necessary to keep the place alive with light and warmth. Shadows swayed across the walls as if echoing the uncertainty that filled the people inside. Keanu kept moving, but not with the restlessness of someone looking for attention. His steps were measured, his eyes calm, scanning the faces around him. He didn't smile widely or wave, but he met people's gazes with a quiet acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you. I'm here." That was all. For some, that acknowledgement was unsettling. A man sitting on a cot with soot-streaked cheeks muttered that this must be some kind of stunt, that maybe tomorrow the headlines would read about Keanu Reeves rescuing the helpless. His bitterness, born of exhaustion and loss, found easy footing among a handful of others who nodded grimly. They had lost too much to trust easily. But on the other side of the gym, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered that she thought he looked kind. Her mother brushed ash from her daughter's hair, glanced at Keanu carrying another stack of blankets, and sighed. Maybe kindness wasn't the strangest thing to find here after all. The tension in the room thickened as the night deepened. Families curled together under thin blankets, listening to the distant thrum of helicopters overhead. Every sound reminded them that the fire was still out there, devouring homes, threatening everything they knew. Against that backdrop, the arrival of a Hollywood actor felt almost surreal, as if two different worlds had collided under the same smoky roof. Keanu paused near the bleachers, placing his duffel bag down again. From it, he pulled out a folded jacket, worn at the elbows, and handed it to a teenage boy shivering in a t-shirt. The boy blinked, wide-eyed, then clutched the jacket to his chest, not even realizing until later whose jacket he was wearing. Keanu didn't linger to see the boy's reaction. He simply turned back toward the supply line and resumed helping. It was then that the whispers turned sharper. Suspicion needed a voice, and one was coming soon. A volunteer at the edge of the room, worn down from endless hours, watched Keanu with narrowed eyes. He muttered again, louder this time, his voice carrying across the gym. Though most people pretended not to hear, the words sank into the air like sparks waiting to catch. The unease was ready to ignite. Everyone felt it, the collision of doubt, exhaustion, and the presence of someone who didn't belong to the world of cots and rationed water. The stage was set for confrontation, though Keanu himself remained unaware, bent low to help a grandmother tie the laces of her shoes. In that gymnasium filled with smoke, tears, and suspicion, a single question hung unspoken over every head. Why was he here? The unease that had been circling the gym finally found its spark. Near the tables where volunteers handed out sandwiches and granola bars, a young man in a yellow vest leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, eyes locked on Keanu. His hair was messy, his face streaked with soot, and exhaustion weighed heavy on him. He had been there since the fires began, pulling double shifts, watching entire families pour through the doors with stories that broke him down piece by piece. He didn't see a movie star. He saw a disruption. When Keanu bent down to help an elderly woman carry a box of canned goods, the volunteer's lips twisted into a bitter grin. His voice rose above the hushed murmur of the camp, sharp and biting. "What's the matter, Hollywood? Here to pose for charity photos?" The words sliced through the heavy air like a knife. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Even the children stirring restlessly in their cots grew quiet, sensing the tension. The remark carried more than sarcasm. It carried resentment, the frustration of a man who had worked himself raw, without recognition, suddenly confronted with someone who would be noticed no matter what he did. It was the voice of bitterness, but in that gym full of fragile spirits, it was also the voice of suspicion. A ripple of reaction swept the room. A few people chuckled nervously, their laughter fueled by the same exhaustion that had driven the volunteers' words. Others smirked, leaning forward, expecting a spectacle. Surely the star would be offended. Surely he would leave as quickly as he came. But Keanu did not stiffen. He did not glare or defend himself. He slowly straightened, setting the box carefully onto the table before turning toward the voice. His eyes were steady, his face calm. For a moment, the silence in the gym felt dangerous, as if the wrong word could ignite the crowd. Then he smiled. It wasn't a wide, forced grin. It was small, quiet, almost weary, but it reached his eyes. He gave the faintest nod and said, in a voice so soft it barely carried, "No cameras, just here to help." The words seemed to hang in the smoky air, fragile and deliberate. The young volunteer blinked, caught off guard. He had expected defensiveness, a sharp retort, maybe even arrogance. What he got instead was humility, plain and unshakable. Around them, the evacuees shifted uneasily. Some looked down at their laps, embarrassed by the sneer that had been thrown so publicly. Others tilted their heads, curious. The smirks faded into silence. For the first time since the fire had driven them here, the people in the gym weren't thinking about flames or smoke. They were watching one man's answer to contempt. The tension lingered, heavy and unresolved, like a chord left unfinished. It was the kind of silence that could lead either to ridicule or respect, depending on what came next. The gym remained suspended in that uneasy quiet. The smell of smoke drifted in each time the doors opened, mingling with the unspoken tension. People held their breath, waiting to see if the bitter remark would spark something more. The young volunteer shifted his weight, suddenly unsure of himself. He had expected laughter to follow his words, maybe even a murmur of agreement from others. Instead, the calm reply had stopped him cold. He looked down at the floor, the cocky grin slipping, but he said nothing more. His silence left space for the rest of the room to judge. On the far side of the gym, a teenage boy whispered to his sister that maybe the actor was serious about helping. She didn't answer, but she couldn't take her eyes off the man in the baseball cap who had refused to take the bait. She had seen arguments explode over less in this shelter, over who got the last blanket, over whose child received juice before milk ran out. She had expected the star to walk out the door, offended, but he stayed. Keanu reached for another box, this one filled with bottles of water, and carried it toward the new arrivals who had come in coughing minutes earlier. His movements were deliberate, steady, as if the comment hadn't even touched him. He set the box down with care, knelt briefly to open it, and passed a bottle to a little boy with soot smeared across his cheeks. The boy clutched it tightly, his mother mouthing a quiet thank you, too tired to speak aloud. That simple act shifted something in the room. Parents who had smirked uneasily now glanced at each other, reconsidering. A man who had muttered earlier about publicity stunts rubbed his chin, uneasy with his own cynicism. Even the tired coordinators at the supply table exchanged glances. The sarcastic volunteer watched all of this, his arms still crossed. He wanted to believe the worst, but the proof before his eyes was harder to dismiss. There were no cameras, no press, no flashing lights, just a man handing out water bottles in a gym filled with people who had lost everything. And yet, suspicion didn't vanish instantly. Suspicion never does. Some evacuees still whispered that maybe the cameras would come later, that maybe he was just laying the groundwork for a story to sell. Their doubts were stubborn, born from the pain of losing homes, pets, and neighbors. But the softness of his words, "just here to help," lingered in their ears. The quiet was broken by a baby's cry. Keanu turned his head, noticed a mother fumbling for a clean bottle. Without hesitation, he walked over, opened another supply box, and found a canister of formula. He handed it to her without a word, then moved on before she could protest. Her eyes filled with tears. She had been worrying about asking for more, ashamed of needing so much, but he had given it freely, with no judgment. The camp seemed to exhale all at once. The hush that settled over the gym was unlike the silence from before. It was no longer suspicious, brittle silence. It carried a different weight, as if everyone were reevaluating what they thought they knew. The words of the volunteer still hung in the air, but now they seemed small compared to what had followed. Keanu moved as though nothing had been said at all. He kept carrying boxes, handing out items, checking on the elderly who struggled to rise from their cots. He never rushed, never sought acknowledgement. To some, it looked like stubborn humility. To others, it looked like proof that the insult hadn't been necessary in the first place. The young volunteer, the one who had spoken, shifted uncomfortably. His chest still rose and fell with the sharp breaths of someone running on fumes. He had given so much of himself in recent days that bitterness had filled the cracks where energy used to be. He had wanted to wound, to expose what he believed was false, but his sarcasm had only spotlighted his own exhaustion. He lowered his gaze, fiddling with the strap of his vest, unable to meet the actor's calm eyes when Keanu passed near him again. The evacuees were not blind. They saw the clash, and they saw who had walked away with grace. Some parents whispered to their children about the importance of staying kind, even when mocked. Others simply watched, silent, but their expressions told the story. Something was shifting in the room, a fragile transformation that would take time to settle. But it had started here. Keanu's words replayed themselves in the minds of those who had heard them. No cameras, just here to help. It was so simple that it felt almost strange. In a world where so many promises came laced with conditions, where aid often carried hidden motives, his quiet answer felt disarming. Hours later, long after the remark had been spoken, the echo of it still lingered. When the gym door swung open again, and more families stumbled inside coughing and crying, it was Keanu who stepped forward first. He grabbed a blanket, draped it over a shivering teenager, and guided him to an open cot. His movements were wordless but full of intent, reinforcing everything he had already said. At the corner of the room, the sarcastic volunteer finally sat down on a folding chair, his elbows resting on his knees. His anger had drained, leaving only fatigue and a heavy sense of shame. He didn't apologize, not yet, but the look in his eyes was softer. He had seen something that cracked his armor of cynicism. The camp returned to its rhythm. Volunteers moved supplies, parents soothed their children, and the steady hum of survival filled the gym once more. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of change. The insult had been spoken, yes, but it had been met not with fury or pride, but with humility. That moment became a silent marker for everyone there, a turning point in how they would look at the man who had walked in with a duffel bag and no fanfare. The tension had not vanished. It clung stubbornly, like smoke that refused to lift. But now, it was different. It wasn't the suspicion of whether he belonged. It was the anticipation of what he might do next. The gym never truly quieted. Even when voices hushed, the sound of coughing broke through like a rhythm no one could silence. Smoke had seeped into the very walls, clinging to clothing and hair, making eyes water and throats sting. Each breath tasted of ash, a bitter reminder of what had been lost beyond those doors. Children whimpered in their sleep, some startled awake by nightmares, others soothed only by the embrace of weary parents. The air buzzed with exhaustion, grief, and the unshakable uncertainty of tomorrow. Keanu walked among them with no spotlight, no introduction, only the steady presence of someone who refused to draw attention to himself. He lifted boxes of bottled water, the weight pulling against his shoulders, and carried them from the storage corner to the distribution tables. He shifted stacks of folded blankets, laying them out neatly so volunteers could grab them quickly. He fetched cartons of food, set them down with care, then returned for more without a word. To many, he seemed almost invisible. The celebrity image people expected did not appear here. He was not the center of the room, not telling stories or commanding attention. He simply blended into the flow of movement, unnoticed by those too tired to care who carried the boxes so long as the work was done. When the lead coordinator, a woman with her hair tied back under a baseball cap, spotted him, she hesitated. She knew who he was. Everyone did, but she treated him like anyone else. "Can you move those crates closer to the back wall?" she asked briskly. "We'll need the space clear for cots." "Yes, ma'am," Keanu replied, no trace of hesitation. He stacked the crates along the wall, working methodically, not cutting corners, not rushing as though the task were beneath him. He stood in line alongside other volunteers to receive his next assignment, waiting his turn like anyone else. No one would have guessed that the man standing quietly, with hands folded, was one of the most recognizable faces in the world. Eyewitnesses would later say that it wasn't his fame that struck them most that night, but his silence. He did not announce himself. He did not use his name as a ticket to earn favor. He spoke only when asked, nodded when given instructions, and carried them out with a kind of discipline that brought order to chaos. The children noticed first. They watched him moving back and forth, head bowed, hair falling across his forehead as he bent to lift another box. Some whispered among themselves, pointing softly, but he never looked up to catch them staring. His silence gave them space to feel safe, to believe that maybe he was there for them, not for himself. The hush of his presence rippled slowly through the adults. People who had been skeptical now found themselves watching longer, unsettled by how deliberately he chose invisibility. It wasn't what they expected, and it forced them to question why he had come at all. The coordinator gave out more instructions, her voice carrying over the restless shuffling of the evacuees. "We've got more blankets coming in, stack them by the bleachers, and check with the kitchen crew, they need help unpacking boxes." Keanu nodded without hesitation. He didn't linger near her, didn't try to charm her or explain who he was. He simply bent to the task, lifting bundles of blankets and hauling them across the gym. Dust and ash clung to the fabric, shaking loose with each movement. When a corner slipped from his grip, he crouched quickly to gather it again. tying the bundle tighter before setting it in its place. Other volunteers noticed. Some tried not to stare, but their eyes followed him as he moved back and forth. One of them whispered that it was strange he was working like he had done this before. Another muttered that maybe he was just trying to look useful. Still, no one could deny the steadiness in his motions, the way he folded into their rhythm instead of breaking it. At the kitchen doorway, steam rolled out into the smoky air, mixing the smell of soup with the acrid scent of ash. Keanu slipped inside, found the crew elbow-deep in boxes, and began unpacking cartons without waiting to be asked. He tore open plastic wrap, stacked cans neatly, and slid trays onto the counter. The cook, a woman with streaks of soot across her apron, looked up in surprise. "You don't have to," she began, then stopped. He was already reaching for another box, calm and unbothered. She shook her head but allowed him to continue. Back in the gym, parents sat with their children, their eyes following him as he passed. Some had grown used to celebrities swooping into disaster zones with bright lights and promises. But this was different. There were no speeches, no cameras, only the sound of cardboard tearing, the scrape of crates against the floor, and the quiet shuffle of boots as he went about the work. The silence of his presence became louder than the coughs and the whispers. He never explained himself, and that left space for the people around him to wonder. Why here? Why now? A teenager scribbled in her notebook, sketching the scene. Rows of cots, the haze of smoke, and the familiar figure bent over a stack of supplies. She didn't draw him as a star, but as another worker, shoulders hunched under the same burden everyone else carried. Later, she would remember the way no one expected anything from him, and yet he kept giving. When a little boy stumbled on his way across the gym, coughing hard, Keanu bent to lift him gently by the shoulders and walked him back to his mother. He said nothing, only waited until the child was seated, then continued with his work. The mother, too overwhelmed to speak, pressed a hand to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. It was in that silence that people began to believe. The night dragged on, but the work never slowed. Supplies kept arriving in small, uneven waves, sometimes a stack of canned food from a quarter floods. Church, sometimes bags of clothes donated by strangers from nearby towns. Every delivery had to be sorted, lifted, stacked, and distributed. Keanu stayed with the flow, moving from one corner of the gym to the other like a shadow that never tired. The coordinator called for volunteers to form a chain to unload a van outside. Keanu stepped into the line without question. He passed box after box down the line, his hands dusted with cardboard fibers, his arms aching like everyone else's. No one gave him lighter loads. No one shielded him from the labor. He didn't ask for it. When a box nearly slipped from the hands of a teenage boy, Keanu steadied it, gave him an encouraging nod, and kept the chain moving. Later, when the van was empty and the supplies stacked inside, the chain dissolved. People drifted back to their duties, or to their families. Keanu lingered for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His breathing was heavy, his shoulders tense, but there was no complaint on his lips. He picked up another bundle of blankets and carried it to a far corner where a family of 4 huddled close together. Eyewitnesses would later remember this night not for anything he said, but for what he didn't. He didn't talk about movies or fame. He didn't tell stories or announce why he was there. He didn't try to lead with words. His silence carried more weight than a speech ever could. Children watched him with wide eyes, whispering softly to their parents. Parents whispered back, unsure what to make of him, but unwilling to stop their children from staring. Volunteers began to realize that his presence steadied them. If someone like him could bend his back to the same labor, then maybe they could push through one more hour. The coughs and quiet weeping still filled the gym, but underneath them was something new, an undercurrent of focus, of shared strength, and it had begun with silence. In one corner, the sarcastic volunteer from earlier sat with his head in his hands, listening to the scrape of boxes and the shuffle of boots. He didn't apologize, Not yet, but he watched differently now. The bitterness that had once fueled him was replaced with a hesitant respect. He couldn't deny what he was seeing. By midnight, when exhaustion made every movement slower and every breath heavier, Keanu was still working. He folded tarps, pushed brooms across the ash-dusted floor, and helped adjust cots for the new families arriving long after dark. His presence was not loud, but it was steady. And for people who had lost nearly everything, steadiness was a gift more valuable than words. Later, when survivors would speak of that night, they wouldn't quote him. They would remember his silence, the way he listened, the way he worked, and the way he never had to explain why he was there. The next morning began with a delivery truck pulling up outside the gym. Its arrival sent a ripple of energy through the shelter. Families stirred on their cots, volunteers hurried to the doors, and the murmur of anticipation grew louder. Supplies were always the heartbeat of the camp. Every box carried the promise of food, medicine, or warmth. But when the back of the truck opened, chaos erupted. Word spread quickly that more blankets and non-perishable food had arrived. Families crowded toward the distribution tables, pressing in before the volunteers could organize the load. Mothers held their children close, afraid of being pushed aside. Fathers raised their voices, demanding enough for their families. The gym's air, already heavy with smoke, grew hotter with the friction of clashing voices. Volunteers scrambled to control the rush, but their instructions were drowned out. One woman shouted that her children hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. A man snapped back that everyone was in the same position. Two volunteers at the table argued about how many bags to give each person, one insisting on strict rations, the other urging compassion. Boxes toppled, cans rolled across the floor, and tension flared dangerously close to violence. Keanu stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. He could see the fear that pushed people forward, the desperation in their eyes. It wasn't greed that fueled them, it was survival. He stepped forward quietly, weaving through the bodies pressing against the table. His voice did not rise above the noise, but he moved with calm certainty. And slowly, eyes turned toward him. "Stop," he said firmly, but not harshly. "We'll find a way for everyone." The words didn't silence the gym immediately, but the steadiness in his tone cut through some of the panic. A few people stepped back. Volunteers glanced at him, uncertain. The arguing at the table faltered, replaced with uneasy quiet. Keanu bent down, picked up a roll of tape from a volunteer's supply box, and tore a strip free. The sound snapped across the gym floor like a starting pistol. He walked to the center of the basketball court and crouched low, pressing the tape against the floor in a long line. "We divide the room," he said, standing again. "Zones. Everyone gets their turn, and no one gets pushed out." Some evacuees frowned, skeptical. Others tilted their heads, listening. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking what he was doing. The mother whispered that maybe he was making things fair. Keanu tore another strip of tape, knelt, and stretched it out across the opposite side. Soon he was walking the length of the court, marking out zones like a carpenter laying a foundation. A few volunteers hesitated, then joined him, holding the tape steady as he pressed it flat. Together, they divided the gym into 4 wide sections, each one with its own line leading toward the supply tables. The crowd shifted uneasily, waiting to see if the idea would hold. At first, the evacuees didn't move. They clutched their children and their bags, staring at the strips of tape on the floor as though they were barriers rather than solutions. The volunteers looked to one another, unsure if the crowd would accept it. The murmurs rose again, restless and doubtful. Keanu didn't argue. He simply stepped into the first zone, motioning with one hand. "This side, line up here," he said calmly. "You'll get what you need. Then, the next zone. No one will be left behind." The firmness in his tone carried a quiet authority. A few families shuffled hesitantly into place, pulling their cots closer to the taped lines. Once the first group moved, others followed. Parents exchanged cautious glances, then guided their children to the marked areas. Slowly, the chaotic cluster at the supply table began to stretch out into 4 distinct lines. Keanu crouched beside a young boy who clung to his mother's leg, fear etched in his wide eyes.
"Don't worry," he said softly, his voice barely carrying above the noise.
"You'll get your turn." The boy nodded, gripping his mother's hand tighter. The volunteers began to relax, realizing the system was working. One of them leaned toward another and muttered, almost in disbelief, "It's actually calming them down." Another shook her head, her earlier doubts softening into reluctant admiration. Still, not everyone was convinced. A tall man near the back of the gym shouted that the supplies would run out before his family was reached. The words sent a ripple of unease down the lines. Heads turned, anxious voices rising. Keanu didn't dismiss him. He walked toward the man, keeping his steps slow and deliberate. "I understand," he said, "but we'll stretch what we have. If we rush, people get missed. If we line up, everyone gets something. That's the only way it works." The man's jaw tightened, but after a moment, he gave a short nod, pulling his family closer to him. The tension eased again. Keanu returned to the front, kneeling once more to press the tape firmly into the floor, reinforcing the press-to-cant line so they would hold. Sweat dripped down his brow, but he never paused. When a volunteer offered to take over, he shook his head. "I've got it." The coordinator, who had been shouting herself hoarse only minutes before, now stood back watching. Her eyes softened as she realized the difference. The shouting had stopped. The pushing had stopped. People were waiting, quietly, with dignity. It wasn't perfect. There was still fear, still hunger. But order had returned to a place that had teetered on the edge of chaos. And for the first time, many inside that gym looked at Keanu differently. The suspicion had not disappeared, but it had cracked. They could see he wasn't here to posture. He was here to steady the storm. The gym was quiet now, at least compared to the chaos from before. The coughs still echoed. The children still whimpered in their sleep, but the shouting had ended. Families waited in their zones, eyes fixed on the supply tables, their shoulders finally lowering from the tense hunch of desperation. Keanu walked down the taped lines, checking on each group as though he were making sure no one had been forgotten. At one cot, an elderly woman tugged at his sleeve, asking in a trembling voice if she would get medicine for her asthma. He crouched beside her, nodded gently, and assured her that she would. She clasped his hand with surprising strength, tears filling her eyes, then released him with a quiet blessing. At another line, two brothers argued over who would stand where. Keanu knelt, drew an imaginary line with his hand, and told them there was space for both. Their argument fizzled out into shy grins. Their mother, exhausted but grateful, mouthed a silent thank you as he moved on. When the distribution began, it was no longer a frenzy. Volunteers handed out food and blankets steadily, each family stepping forward when their zone was called. The children clutched their portions with wide-eyed relief, parents whispering to them that there was enough, at least for tonight. The fear of scarcity still lingered, but it no longer controlled the room. The coordinator finally stepped forward, resting her hands on her hips, shaking her head in disbelief. She looked at Keanu, who was still pressing tape into the floor to repair a section where children had scuffed it up. "You just saved us hours of fighting," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. He only shrugged. "It's what anyone would do." But the evacuees who watched knew it wasn't what anyone would do. Most would have argued. Most would have taken sides. Most would have tried to shout louder than the chaos. What he had done was different. He had stepped into the storm with calm hands, dividing the space not to control it but to restore dignity. The sarcastic volunteer from the day before stood near the tables, watching. His expression was unreadable, but his arms were no longer crossed. For the first time, he didn't see the man in the cap as an intruder. He saw someone carrying boxes, tearing tape, bending low to listen to frightened children. The sharp edge of his doubt softened, though pride kept him silent. By the time the last family in the final zone received their portion, the gym no longer felt like a battlefield. It wasn't peace, but it was order. Families sat on their cots with food in their laps and blankets over their shoulders. Children chewed slowly, eyes already closing with sleep. The hum of voices had settled into something quieter, something steadier, and in that steadiness, doubt began to loosen its grip. People who had whispered yesterday about cameras and headlines now whispered something else. Maybe he wasn't here for himself, after all. Maybe, in this gym filled with smoke and silence, he was exactly where he needed to be. The new system of zones held steady, but it didn't erase the hard truth. By late afternoon, the supplies were already thinning. The last of the canned goods had been handed out, and the final bundles of blankets had disappeared into grateful arms. The coordinator ran her hands through her hair, staring at the dwindling stacks, her lips pressed tight. Families still needed more, and night was coming again. Keanu noticed it. He saw the coordinator counting boxes twice, frowning as she realized the numbers didn't stretch far enough. He watched the way volunteers whispered to one another about how to ration the little that was left. And he saw the looks on the faces of parents who realized tomorrow might bring empty tables. He didn't draw attention to himself. He slipped outside into the smoky air, pulling his cap lower against the wind. The sky glowed faintly orange in the distance, the fire still raging miles away. Ash swirled with every gust, coating the cars parked along the curb. Keanu pulled out his phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light, and scrolled to a number he rarely used. The call connected with a crackle. A gruff voice answered, half hidden by static. "Keanu? Haven't heard from you in years." "I wouldn't ask unless it mattered," Keanu said quietly. "We've got families here. Kids. Supplies are drying up fast." There was a pause on the other end. Then a low chuckle. "Say no more. We'll bring what we can." The line went dead. Keanu slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned inside, blending once more into the flow of the shelter. He said nothing of the call, not even to the coordinator. He lifted more boxes, shifted more cots, answered when spoken to, and let the hours pass. The evening dragged on. Families settled uneasily into their zones, clutching what little they had been given. Volunteers leaned against the walls, drained, their voices hoarse from long shifts. The coordinator rubbed at her temples, wondering what they would tell the people tomorrow when nothing was left to hand out. Then came the sound. At first it was faint. A low growl in the distance, muffled by the walls of the gym. Heads turned, frowns forming. The growl grew louder, multiplying, swelling into a steady roar that rattled the windows and vibrated through the floor. Parents pulled their children closer, unsure what was coming. Volunteers rushed to the doors, straining to see through the smoke-filled evening. And then, the headlights appeared. One after another, motorcycles cut through the haze, their engines thundering in unison. Behind them came pickup trucks and vans, each one piled high with boxes and bags strapped down with ropes. Leather jackets reflected the glow of the streetlights, their patches catching the eye, but there was no menace in the way they rode. They came with purpose, steady and sure, like a cavalry charging not into war but into relief. The crowd inside gasped. The rumble of engines filled the night until it seemed the whole town was vibrating. Children pressed their faces against the gym windows, wide-eyed. Parents stood behind them, holding their shoulders, whispering questions they didn't have answers to. The doors swung open, and the sound rushed inside like a living thing, loud, raw, undeniable. Then the first bike rolled into view of the crowd at the entrance. Its rider, a broad-shouldered woman with silver hair tucked under her helmet, cut the engine and swung her leg over the seat. She wore a leather jacket with a patch that read, "Guardians MC." Behind her, more riders parked in neat rows, their headlights illuminating the parking lot like a stage. Trucks pulled up alongside them, their beds stacked with crates, bags, and coolers. The evacuees gasped again as the riders began unloading. They didn't just bring food and blankets. They brought everything: medical kits, baby formula, flashlights, bottled water, even toys packed into boxes. The sheer volume was staggering. Volunteers who had been fretting over tomorrow's empty shelves now stood frozen, blinking in disbelief. Keanu was the first to step outside. He moved straight toward the riders, shaking the hand of the woman who had led the group. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but full of weight. She clasped his hand firmly, her smile hidden beneath the shadow of her helmet. "You called," she said. "We answer." One by one, he greeted each rider, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, treating them not as saviors or as muscle, but as equals. To the evacuees watching from the doorway, the sight was almost surreal. The man they had doubted the night before stood shoulder to shoulder with a biker club that had just rolled in like an army of relief. The unloading began quickly. Crates were passed down the line, hands moving fast, voices calling out where to stack the goods. Volunteers rushed forward to help, their exhaustion replaced by a surge of energy. Even evacuees stepped in, eager to carry boxes, eager to be part of this unexpected wave of abundance. The gym, once filled with fear of scarcity, was now alive with motion and hope. The sarcastic volunteer from before stood near the supply tables, his jaw slack. He had been the loudest critic, the one to sneer about charity photos. Now he could only watch as trucks kept pulling in, as crates kept stacking higher than the tables themselves. He muttered something under his breath, but no one heard him. His words had been drowned out by the roar of engines, the laughter of children, and the sound of boxes being opened. Keanu lifted crates alongside the riders, his movements no different than theirs. Sweat dampened his shirt, his hands red from the weight of cardboard, but he kept going, step for step, box for box. The riders nodded to him with respect, not because of his fame, but because he worked like one of them. The astonishment inside the gym grew into something else. It was no longer doubt. It was wonder. The unloading stretched long into the evening. The gym that only hours before had echoed with fear and frustration now buzzed with a strange energy, a mixture of disbelief and relief. Families stepped forward cautiously, as though afraid the sight might vanish if they blinked. Rows of boxes stacked higher, aisles filled with clothing, medicine, and food enough to ease the gnawing fear of scarcity. Children darted between the cots, pointing at the motorcycles parked outside as if they were parade floats. Some of the riders crouched down, handing out stuffed animals and coloring books they had tucked into their saddlebags. A boy who hadn't smiled in days clutched a teddy bear tight to his chest, his eyes lighting up. A little girl held crayons in her ash-stained hands, staring at the colors as if they were a miracle. Keanu kept moving among the riders, not hovering above them but shoulder to shoulder. When one biker wrestled with a crate too heavy for a single person, Keanu stepped in, gripping the other end. They carried it together, set it down, and the rider gave him a firm nod of respect. To anyone watching, the moment looked like a pact sealed in silence. Inside, whispers grew. People who had questioned his motives the night before now murmured to one another about how he had made this happen. They realized he hadn't just shown up with his hands. He had brought an army of help. The sarcasm, the suspicion, all the bitter muttering, none of it could survive the sight of so much generosity thundering in on two wheels. The sarcastic volunteer lingered near the back, his face flushed. Every box that hit the floor, every child who smiled, every parent who exhaled with relief, only deepened the shame sitting heavy in his chest. He remembered his cruel words, the sneer in his voice, and now they rang hollow in his memory. He said nothing, but the hard edge in his expression had softened. When the last crate was set down and the final bike was parked, the riders gathered in a loose circle with Keanu at the center. He didn't raise his voice, didn't deliver a speech, but he shook every hand, looked each rider in the eye, and thanked them as though they were brothers and sisters. The evacuees watched as the exchange unfolded, seeing him not as a star calling in favors, but as a man showing loyalty to the people who answered his call. By the time the engines roared to life again and the riders prepared to leave, the gym was transformed. Where there had been fear, there was gratitude. Where there had been doubt, there was respect. The evacuees stood in clusters, some clapping softly, others simply staring in stunned silence. Parents wept quietly, clutching the food and medicine that meant their children would sleep with full stomachs tonight. And through it all, Keanu never claimed credit. He stood back, wiping sweat from his hands, watching the relief spread across the faces around him. In their astonishment, a truth settled. Whatever they had thought of him before, they could no longer deny what they had witnessed. Night fell hard on the camp. The gym's overhead lights flickered as the generator outside sputtered,
straining to keep power steady. Shadows stretched long across the cots, making the corners of the room feel darker, more uncertain. Parents pulled blankets tighter around their children, trying to shield them not only from the cold air that slipped in through the doors, but from the haunting glow of fire still faintly visible beyond the hills. Children grew restless as the hours dragged on. Some tossed in their cots, whispering about the homes they had lost. Others clung to their parents, crying without words, their small bodies shaking with fear. A baby's wail pierced the room, followed by the muffled sob of his exhausted mother. A few children tried to distract themselves with coloring books given out earlier, but even the bright crayons seemed dull against the heavy silence of the night. Keanu noticed. He had spent the day lifting boxes, carrying supplies, and easing burdens, but now he saw a different need, one that couldn't be met with food or blankets. The children's fear filled the room, spreading like smoke, and without calm, the night would only grow longer and heavier for everyone. He moved quietly toward the corner where his duffel bag rested. Kneeling down, he pulled out a worn guitar case, its black surface scuffed from years of travel. He carried it carefully, as if it held more than wood and strings. The moment he set it down on the floor and unclasped the latches, whispers rippled through the gym. "Does he really play?" a boy asked his sister, eyes wide. "I think so," she whispered back. Parents looked up too, their expressions curious, even doubtful. Some evacuees exchanged glances, wondering if this was another performance meant to draw attention. But the suspicion was weaker now, softened by what they had already seen from him. They waited, holding their children close, uncertain of what would happen next. Keanu eased the guitar from its case, the polished wood catching the faint light of the gym. He sat cross-legged on the floor, resting the instrument on his knee. For a moment, he just let his fingers brush the strings, testing their sound against the hum of the generator. Then, he began to play. The first notes were soft, gentle chords that rose and fell like a lullaby. The sound cut through the restless noise of the camp, not loud, not demanding, but steady and soothing. Conversations faded. Even the coughing slowed, as if people were listening without meaning to. The chords drifted into every corner of the room, carrying with them a warmth that blankets and food could not provide. The children closest to him inched nearer, drawn by the sound. A little girl sat cross-legged in front of him, eyes wide, clutching a teddy bear against her chest. A boy settled beside her, his head tilted as though he couldn't quite believe. This was real. Slowly, the circle widened. For the first time that night, silence came willingly. The music spread like ripples across water. Each chord lingered in the smoky air, soft and unhurried, steadying the restless hearts of those who listened. The children leaned closer, their movements careful, as if afraid that a sudden sound might break the spell. Their parents, weary and watchful, allowed them to gather, comforted by the quiet unfolding around the guitar. Keanu's fingers moved with ease, though his playing was simple. He wasn't trying to impress with speed or skill. He strummed patterns that rose and fell like a heartbeat, steady enough for the children to follow. A boy whispered the rhythm under his breath, and soon others joined, tapping their palms softly against their knees in time. The little girl with the teddy bear tilted her head, her lips parting with a tentative hum. Keanu looked at her gently, encouraging her without words. She hummed louder, and the sound drew smiles from the children beside her. One by one, more voices joined, awkward and quiet at first, then stronger as they realized no one was judging. Parents watched, their eyes glistening. For days, their children had known only fear and smoke. Now, for a brief moment, they sang. The room that had been filled with coughs and sobs now pulsed with fragile music. Keanu shifted into another chord progression, a melody both familiar and timeless, something that sounded like home no matter where home once had been. The children picked it up quickly, their voices carrying the notes with surprising strength. Some clapped in rhythm, others swayed gently where they Saturday. The sound grew until it filled the gym more fully than the hum of the generator or the distant roar of fire outside. Even volunteers paused in their work, leaning against the walls, letting the song wash over them. The coordinator, who had been pacing earlier with worry about supplies, now stood still, hands clasped in front of her as she listened. She glanced at Keanu, her expression softening with gratitude. A boy who had not spoken since arriving at the shelter edged closer to the circle. His mother followed, guiding him with a hand on his back. He sat down stiffly, his eyes fixed on the guitar. When Keanu noticed, he shifted the melody slightly, slowing it down, making it easier for the boy to follow. The boy's lips moved, hesitant at first. Then, sound emerged. His mother covered her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. She hadn't heard her son's voice since the fire. The music carried more than notes. It carried release, a fragile thread stitching together hearts that had been torn open by loss. And Keanu, silent as ever, let the guitar speak for him. The circle around Keanu widened until it filled nearly half the gym. Children leaned against each other, heads nodding with the rhythm, eyes heavy but calmer than they had been all day. Parents settled onto the cots, some rocking their little ones in time with the music, others simply closing their eyes as though the chords themselves were lifting the weight from their shoulders. Keanu shifted into a softer melody, plucking single notes that fell like drops of rain. The children hushed again, listening, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the flickering lights overhead. The generator hummed, but its uneven rhythm now blended with the guitar instead of interrupting it. The fire outside might still burn, but in this gym, there was a pocket of peace. A young boy edged closer, bold enough to rest his hand lightly against the guitar's polished body. Keanu smiled faintly, leaning down so the boy could feel the vibration through the wood. The boy's eyes widened, his mouth forming a small gasp of wonder. Another child tried the same. Then, another. Soon, several sat close enough to feel the hum of the strings through their palms, their faces glowing with awe. The parents watched with tears in their eyes. These were the past. Same children who had cried themselves hoarse at night, who had woken screaming from nightmares of flames and smoke. Now they were still, captivated, soothed not by promises or speeches, but by the simple sound of music. Keanu finally shifted into a lullaby, the kind that didn't belong to any one culture but felt like it had always been known. The notes rose gently, dipped low, and lingered just long enough to cradle the children's heavy eyelids. One by one, they began to sag against their parents' shoulders, their voices fading as sleep pulled them under. The restless coughs and cries dwindled into silence. By the time the last chord faded, the circle had become a patchwork of sleeping children, their teddy bears and blankets clutched tight. Parents wiped their faces quietly, careful not to disturb the peace that had finally settled over them. The volunteers, who had been leaning against the walls, now stood straighter, their exhaustion softened by the reminder of why they were here. Keanu placed the guitar gently back into its case, closed the latches, and set it aside. He didn't look for applause. He didn't speak. He simply sat there for a moment longer, his hands resting loosely in his lap, watching the children breathe evenly in their sleep. Eyewitnesses would later say that the silence after the music ended was louder than the fire outside. It was the silence of relief, of gratitude, of hearts that had been steadied. And it was in that silence that doubt truly began to fade. The first notes drifted into the smoky night like something half-remembered, soft enough to make people lean closer, steady enough to anchor them. Keanu's fingers moved across the strings with patience, shaping a melody that carried the simplicity of a folk song. It wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, it was human. The sound filled the gym not with grandeur but with warmth, the kind that reminded people of porches, campfires, and nights when the world felt safe. Children gathered instinctively, the way moths are drawn to light. Some clutched their blankets around their shoulders, their eyes wide as if they feared the music might vanish if they blinked. Others leaned against each other, heads tilted, following every rise and fall of the tune. Their small voices whispered questions to their parents, but the answers were unspoken. They didn't need to be told what this was. They felt it. Keanu's gaze moved over them, calm and encouraging. He shifted the pattern, repeating a simple refrain that lingered like a question in the air. Then he hummed it softly, low and steady, until the children began to recognize the rhythm. One brave girl with tangled hair hummed along, tentative at first. Keanu nodded gently, letting the sound grow. Soon another joined, then another. The refrain repeated again, and now more voices picked it up. Their notes wobbled, imperfect, but they carried something the guitar alone could not: hope. Keanu slowed the tempo, making it easier for the younger ones to follow, then spoke quietly between chords. "Like this," he said. "We'll sing it together." The children leaned in, their voices rising as they caught the tune. The words were few, almost none at all, just sounds stretched into melody, but it was enough. The song circled the gym like a thread, weaving through the smoke and shadows, stitching people together who had felt only torn apart. Parents watched from their cots, their eyes glistening as the music carried across the floor. One mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened to her daughter sing again for the first time since their house burned. A father bent low, pressing his forehead to the top of his son's head as the boy swayed with the rhythm. For the first time since the fires began, the gym didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like home. The kind of home that didn't need walls or roofs or furniture. It was made from voices rising together, from music that reminded them they were still alive, still capable of joy. The guitar kept the heartbeat steady, but it was the children who carried the song. The refrain grew stronger with each repetition, no longer fragile whispers, but voices gaining courage. Children who had been silent all day now sang with wide eyes, their voices rising and falling in unison. The melody was simple enough for everyone to follow, and that simplicity gave it power. It wasn't a performance, it was a gathering. Keanu leaned forward slightly, guiding them with gentle strums. He let the children lead the pace, adjusting his chords to match their rhythm. When some faltered, he repeated the refrain again, slower, until they caught it. Laughter bubbled up from a group of younger kids who had turned the clapping into a game, and the sound of their joy spread quickly. Soon, the room was alive, not just with music, but with the kind of laughter people thought they had forgotten. At the edges of the circle, parents stood motionless, their emotions catching them by surprise. Many hadn't seen their children smile in days. Some hadn't heard them laugh at all since the fire. Tears ran freely down their faces as they watched their sons and daughters sing to a melody carried by a man they had once doubted. The same man who had lifted boxes, laid tape lines, and now sat cross-legged on the floor, coaxing hope from 6 guitar strings. A boy sitting near the front held his little sister in his lap, whispering the words in her ear so she could sing too. She clapped along offbeat, but no one corrected her. The sound was perfect in its imperfection. Beside them, a group of older kids swayed back and forth, some with eyes closed, their voices breaking but strong. The song echoed off the high gym walls, filling every space where despair had settled. Volunteers leaned against the tables, their exhaustion melting as the music washed over them. The coordinator, her hands pressed against her chest, whispered to the person beside her, "It feels like they've come back to life." As the refrain looped again, Keanu added a gentle harmony, his deep voice threading beneath the children's higher tones. The sound blended, rich and grounding, anchoring the fragile notes with steady strength. The children responded instinctively, their singing growing louder, bolder, no longer afraid of being heard. Parents joined in softly from where they Saturday. At first it was only a handful, hesitant, but soon more voices swelled from the cots and corners. They didn't sing loudly, but they didn't need to. Their presence deepened the chorus, turning the children's song into something fuller, something that carried the weight of survival. It was no longer just a lullaby. It was a declaration. Against the ashes, against the fear, against the loss, they still had their voices. And in that moment, their voices mattered more than the fire outside. The song carried on, rising and falling like a tide. For a time, no one in the gym thought about what they had lost. They weren't counting supplies
or worrying about tomorrow, or replaying the sound of flames. They were singing. Their voices, uneven but united, created something that felt stronger than the fire that had chased them here. Children swayed with the rhythm, their eyes reflecting the soft glow of the gym lights. Some still clutched their blankets, their knuckles white, but their voices rang clear. Others sang so loudly they startled themselves, then laughed, and the laughter rippled through the circle. What began as hesitance had become joy. Keanu slowed the strumming, guiding them toward a softer ending. The refrain repeated once more, voices dropping with the fading chords, until only a few notes lingered in the air. Silence followed, but it wasn't the silence of despair they had known all week. It was a silence filled with breathless awe, as if no one wanted to be the first to let the moment go. Then a child clapped, once, shyly. Another followed. Soon the circle erupted in applause, small hands smacking together with enthusiasm. Parents joined, their clapping punctuated by sobs they could no longer hold back. Tears streaked tired faces, but for once, those tears came from relief. The coordinator brushed her eyes, laughing softly as she shook her head. They needed this, she whispered to herself. Volunteers nodded, still stunned by what had unfolded. They had seen Keanu hauling boxes and stacking crates, but this was different. He hadn't just fed the body, he had fed the spirit. Keanu lowered the guitar gently to his lap, his eyes moving over the children who now leaned against one another, smiling, humming fragments of the tune as if they wanted to keep it alive. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The music had said enough. Parents began pulling their children back to their cots, but the song lingered on their lips. Some hummed it softly as they tucked their kids beneath donated blankets. Others whispered it like a prayer, their voices trembling but steady. The gym, once filled with restless cries, now pulsed with calm. From the back of the room, the sarcastic volunteer who had once sneered stood with his arms at his sides, watching quietly. His face was softer now, touched with something that looked like regret. He had mocked the idea of a Hollywood star coming to their aid, but tonight he had seen the impossible. Music turning ashes into hope. As the lights flickered once more and the night deepened, the camp felt different. For the first time since the fire began, it felt like a home, not made of wood or brick, but of voices, tears, and a song that had carried them through the darkness. The last notes of the children's song faded into the rafters, and a stillness swept over the gym. Keanu adjusted his guitar, his fingers lingering on the strings for a moment before sliding into another melody. This one was slower, gentler, carrying the cadence of a lullaby. The chords floated softly, weaving into the smoky air, and the effect was immediate. Children leaned heavily against their parents' shoulders, eyelids drooping. Some who had been restless all evening now nestled into the crook of their mother's arms, soothed by the quiet rhythm. A baby who had been crying earlier gave a final hiccup, then sank into sleep as his mother rocked him in time with the music. The gym, once filled with coughing, whispers, and fear, grew calm in a way no one had expected. Parents glanced at each other, their surprise plain. One mother bent close to the woman beside her and whispered, "I haven't seen him smile since we left the house." She stroked her son's hair as his lips curled into the faintest grin in his sleep. The other mother pressed her hand over her mouth, her own tears falling. The lullaby carried on, each note wrapping itself around the listeners like a blanket. For exhausted parents, the sound unlocked something deeper than relief. Tears slid down their faces silently, tears they had fought to hide from their children all week. Some held their kids tighter, their sobs muffled in their children's hair. Others let the tears fall freely, no longer caring who saw. Gratitude mixed with sorrow, exhaustion with hope, until emotions spilled over in a way words could never capture. Keanu played with eyes half closed, his head bowed slightly as though the song belonged as much to him as to the children. He didn't force it, didn't raise his voice above the chords. He let the guitar breathe for him, and in that breath, the parents found space to let go. A father who had carried his daughter through miles of smoke pressed his forehead to her head, whispering, "You're safe now."
His tears slid into her tangled hair as she slept soundly for the first time in days. A young mother near the wall sat trembling, the weight of the past week crashing down at last. Her husband, who hadn't spoken since their home was lost, reached out and held her hand, both of them crying silently as the lullaby carried them. The sarcastic volunteer stood near the supply tables, his vest streaked with ash. He had mocked this man 2 nights earlier, sneered at his presence, called him out for supposed vanity. Now he stood frozen, watching the scene before him with his throat tight. The camp was transformed. The children who had cried endlessly were sleeping peacefully. Parents who had carried bitterness in their eyes now wept with relief. He couldn't deny it, he had been wrong. His words seemed shameful now, echoing in his memory like a wound he had inflicted on himself. He pressed his lips together, silent, ashamed, wishing he could take them back. The guitar continued to hum in the background, a steady rhythm that lulled the camp into something rare: rest. For the first time since the fires began, parents no longer feared what would happen when night fell. They had found a kind of refuge no walls could provide, and the sound of it was enough to keep them grounded. The lullaby wound its way deeper into the night, soft but unyielding, steady as a heartbeat. Parents who had been pacing earlier now sat still on their cots, their children curled safely against them. The gym lights flickered again, but no one seemed to notice. The glow of the music was stronger than the unreliable bulbs overhead. A mother near the entrance rocked her toddler, her lips trembling as she whispered the words of the refrain back to him. The boy stirred, then stilled, breathing evenly against her chest. She closed her eyes, feeling the first true calm since their evacuation. Beside her, another mother whispered to her neighbor, "I thought he'd never sleep again. He wakes screaming every night." Her neighbor nodded, her cheeks streaked with tears, and whispered back, "Look at him now." The change was undeniable. The restless tension that had haunted the shelter dissolved into something else entirely. It wasn't just the children who were soothed. Parents who had kept their fears bottled inside finally let them out, their tears running freely. Some sobbed quietly into their hands. Others leaned on each other, the unspoken grief of everything lost carried away on the chords of the guitar. Keanu's playing shifted, a few brighter notes sliding into the melody. It was still a lullaby, but now it held a glimmer of reassurance, as though telling the weary families that dawn would come. His face remained calm, his expression unassuming, but the effect was profound. A man who had spent the entire week silent, sitting on the edge of his cot, finally broke down. His wife wrapped her arms around him as he cried into her shoulder. Another parent, clutching his sleeping son, whispered through tears, "I thought I'd lost him. I thought the fire would take him." He kissed the boy's hair, his sobs muffled by gratitude. The sarcastic volunteer remained rooted to the floor, his earlier words replaying in his mind with painful clarity. He had accused this man of coming for attention, of posing for charity. Now he watched an entire gym of broken families lifted into a fragile peace by music. Shame burned in his chest. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet anyone's eyes, and for the first time in days, he said nothing. The lullaby continued until one by one, every child was asleep. Their breaths came steady and even, their small bodies finally at rest. Parents sat in silence, some still crying, others simply watching their children as though afraid to let go of the moment. When Keanu strummed the final chord, he did not speak. He set the guitar gently beside him and folded his hands, sitting quietly in the circle of children now fast asleep. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. But it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of gratitude, of relief, of hearts finally given permission to rest. And in that silence, parents wept openly, not for loss alone, but for the gift of a night where their children could dream again. Morning crept into the valley slowly, its light muted by the lingering smoke that still hung over the camp. Inside the gym, the families stirred awake. Some rubbed their eyes, startled that they had slept through the night without the usual fear and restlessness. Others sat up slowly, holding their children close, marveling that their little ones had finally found peace. The lullabies of the night before were still etched into their memories, their echoes stronger than the sound of the fire that had haunted them for days. As people rose, they began whispering. Not the anxious whispers of doubt or worry, but whispers of gratitude. Last night, it felt like hope again, one man murmured to his wife as he tucked a blanket around their sleeping daughter. She nodded, her eyes misty. Others repeated similar words to one another, quietly, almost reverently, as though afraid to break the fragile gift they had been given. Some parents gathered near the supply tables, looking for the man who had played the guitar. They wanted to thank him, to tell him what his presence had meant. But when they found him, he wasn't waiting for praise. Keanu was near the far corner of the gym, sweeping ash that had drifted in under the doors during the night. His cap was pulled low, his sleeves rolled up, his movements steady and unhurried. A group of children spotted him first. They ran to the corner, their voices bright with morning energy. They wanted him to play again, to sing another song, but he only smiled softly and told them they'd have to wait until later. He picked up a stack of folding chairs and carried them toward the wall, setting them neatly out of the way. To him, the work was still unfinished. The survivors slowly gathered around him, some standing quietly, others stepping forward with words of thanks. A woman pressed her hand to her heart as she told him how her son had slept for the first time since the fire. Another man said his family hadn't smiled in days, but last night they had laughed. The words tumbled out in broken voices, but each carried the same truth. What he had given them could not be measured in supplies or food. Keanu listened with the same patience he had shown all along. He nodded, clasped hands when offered, but each time someone tried to thank him directly, he shifted the credit elsewhere. The volunteers kept this place running, he said. The bikers brought the supplies. I just followed their lead. His voice was steady, not self-effacing, but honest. He pointed to the coordinator, to the young men and women in yellow vests who had spent endless days hauling boxes and organizing chaos. Still, the people knew. They had seen the change, felt it in the air. Yet they respected his humility, letting his words stand while holding their gratitude silently in their hearts. The whispers continued to spread across the gym. Last night was different. Last night, we believed again. As the morning wore on, the gym shifted from the quiet reverence of waking to the busyness of another day. Volunteers began distributing breakfast from the supplies the bikers had delivered: granola bars, oatmeal packets, and juice boxes. Children lined up with more patience than the day before, still humming bits of the tune they had sung with Keanu. Their voices carried across the room like faint reminders that even in disaster, joy could find its way back. Parents gathered in clusters, sipping water or coffee from paper cups. The conversations were different now. Instead of trading stories of fear and loss, they spoke about the night's song. One mother described how her daughter had fallen asleep mid-chorus, her lips still moving to the words. Another father said his son had slept without nightmares for the first time since the evacuation. Each story echoed the same refrain. For a few hours, they had been carried out of the fire's shadow. Through it all, Keanu kept to the background. He never stayed in the center. Of the groups that formed around him, whenever people approached with thanks, he redirected the moment, pointing toward the volunteers who carried trays or the bikers who were still unloading odds and ends from their trucks. He spoke little, but his actions were constant moving chairs, gathering empty boxes, even kneeling to tie down a tarp that had loosened during the night. A few volunteers whispered about him while they worked. One young man who had doubted him before muttered, "He works harder than half of us." Another replied quietly, "And he doesn't want anyone to notice." They fell silent as he passed by, carrying a stack of bedding toward the laundry pile. By mid-morning, the survivors had started to rebuild a sense of routine. Some parents read to their children. Others cleaned their little areas of the gym, shaking out blankets and sweeping the ash. The laughter of children drifted more freely now, unburdened by constant fear. The community, fractured and wounded, was beginning to knit itself back together. It wasn't just the supplies that had changed things. It was the spirit that had returned overnight. People spoke more gently to each other, shared more freely, and reached out in ways they hadn't before. The whispers followed Keanu, as he moved quietly from task to task. Last night, it felt like hope again. The sarcastic volunteer lingered near the back, silent. He had said little since the music, but now he found himself studying the man he had mocked, watching him sweep, watching him bend to comfort a child who had scraped his knee. He felt a tightening in his chest. He had judged too quickly, too harshly, and he knew it. Shame stayed his tongue, but respect grew in its place. By noon, the gym was brighter, not because the smoke had cleared, but because something had shifted inside. People looked at one another differently. They carried themselves with a new steadiness, a quiet determination that hadn't been there the day before. And though Keanu never sought the credit, everyone knew what had sparked it. The community had awakened. The rhythm of the camp had settled into something steadier when the doors opened again late that afternoon. A woman stepped inside, not with the weary shuffle of an evacuee, but with the brisk stride of someone chasing a story. She carried a camera bag over one shoulder and clutched a microphone in her hand. Her hair was tied neatly back, her clothes crisp despite the ash that clung to the air outside. A cameraman followed close behind, adjusting his lens as his eyes darted across the gym. The evacuees noticed instantly. Conversations hushed. Parents pulled their children a little closer, not out of fear, but from a raw weariness of being turned into images. For days, cameras had come and gone, recording their losses, capturing their grief, turning their pain into headlines. Many here no longer trusted the presence of a lens. The reporter's eyes scanned the gym, lingering for only a moment on the families before locking on the figure-stacking chairs in the corner. Recognition lit her face. She moved quickly, her heels clicking against the floor as the cameraman hurried to keep pace. "Mr. Reeves," she called, her voice bright, practiced for broadcast. "Can we have a word?" Keanu looked up, pausing mid-motion. The chair in his hands hovered for a second before he set it gently against the wall. He gave a polite nod, but his eyes remained calm, reserved. "We'd love a quick interview," the reporter continued, stepping closer. "People would be inspired to know you're here helping." She gestured toward the cameraman, who was already raising his lens, framing the shot. Around them, families shifted uneasily. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared openly, waiting to see what he would do. The sarcastic volunteer leaned against the supply table, his jaw tightening. He had been the first to accuse Keanu of seeking publicity. Now the test was in front of everyone. Keanu shook his head gently. "I'm not here for that," he said, his voice steady but quiet. The reporter pressed on, her tone sharpening. "But don't you think people would want to hear from you? You're a celebrity. Your voice could make this story bigger, maybe bring more donations." Just a few words. Keanu's expression softened, but he didn't move toward the camera. Instead, he folded his arms lightly and shook his head again. "I think the focus should be on them," he said, tilting his head toward the evacuees scattered across the gym. The cameraman adjusted his lens, zooming closer. The reporter's practiced smile faltered. She was used to persistence winning, used to coaxing a soundbite even from the reluctant. But this man wasn't raising his voice, wasn't even defensive. His calm refusal unsettled her. Still, she tried again. "Please, Mr. Reeves, just one statement. What made you come here? What do you want people to know?" Keanu glanced past her, his eyes landing on a young woman sitting on a cot near the back wall. She held a toddler in her lap, the child's face pressed against her chest, one small hand gripping her shirt. The mother's eyes were hollow with exhaustion, but her posture was proud, protective. She had been quiet since arriving, barely speaking to anyone. Keanu stepped aside and motioned gently toward her. His voice carried, though it remained soft. "Her story matters more than mine." The reporter blinked, thrown off script. Excuse me?" Keanu turned fully, walking toward the young mother. He extended his hand, not to take her child, but to invite her forward if she wished. She lost her home. She's keeping her family safe. That's the story you should tell. The gym fell into silence again. Every eye followed the exchange, waiting to see what would happen. The mother hesitated, clutching her child closer, but Keanu's quiet nod gave her courage. Slowly, she stood, the toddler clinging to her. The reporter lowered her microphone slightly, caught off guard. This wasn't the angle she had expected. She had come for a headline about a Hollywood star helping wildfire victims. Instead, she was being asked to shift the spotlight. The cameraman glanced at her uncertainly, then slowly panned toward the young mother. The woman's voice trembled at first, but she steadied it as she spoke. "We lost everything. The fire came so fast we barely made it out. My son hasn't had a bed in a week. Last night was the first time he slept without crying." Her arms tightened around the toddler, who nestled deeper into her chest. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I know we're still here. That's all that matters." Her words landed heavier than any prepared statement could have. Parents nearby nodded, tears brimming in their eyes. Volunteers stilled, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as they listened. Even the sarcastic volunteer, who had carried guilt since his cruel remark, lowered his head, unable to hide his emotion. The reporter hesitated, her professional instincts warring with the raw honesty before her. Slowly, she lifted the microphone again, this time holding it gently toward the young mother. The cameraman adjusted his focus, capturing her weary face, her son's tiny hand clutching her shirt, the ash still smudged across her skin. Keanu stepped back, silent, his role complete. He didn't stand in the frame, didn't try to add to her words. He folded his arms loosely, content to let the moment belong to her. His refusal to be the center of attention was itself a statement, one that echoed louder than if he had spoken. The young mother finished quietly. "We don't need pity. We need to be seen. We need people to remember that we're still out here." Her voice cracked, but she stood straighter, her eyes shining with dignity. The gym erupted in soft applause. It wasn't loud or jubilant, but full of respect. Parents clapped with one hand while holding their children with the other. Volunteers joined in, their palms striking together slowly, reverently. The sound swelled, not for a celebrity, not for a headline, but for a survivor who had finally been given a voice. The reporter swallowed hard, her eyes misting. She turned toward Keanu, microphone lowered once more. For the first time, she had no follow-up question, no angle to push. She nodded, almost bowing, her voice quiet as she said, "You're right. Her story matters more." As evening settled again over the camp, the gym took on a quieter tone. Dinner had been served from the donated supplies, and families sat around the folding tables in small clusters. The children were calmer now, their laughter echoing in short bursts before fading into yawns. Parents leaned on their elbows, too tired to speak much, yet reluctant to end the rare sense of peace the day had given them. It was in that quiet that stories began to surface, not all at once, but in slow, careful voices, as if each survivor was testing whether it was safe to speak. A farmer, at the far end of a table, was the first to break the silence. His hands were thick and calloused, his nails still stained from the soil he could no longer tend. He stared down at his empty cup as he spoke. "I had 200 acres, he said softly. "It was all I'd ever known. My father built that farm, my grandfather before him, and now," his words caught, his jaw tightening, "it's gone. All of it. Fences, barns, the house nothing but black ground and ash." No one interrupted. A few nodded, their faces solemn. Keanu, sitting on the edge of the table beside him, leaned forward, his posture open, his gaze steady. "That's a lifetime's work," he said quietly. "It's not just land, it's your family's history." The farmer's eyes glistened. He let out a shaky breath, relieved that someone understood the weight of what had been lost. He nodded once, then twice, as though giving himself permission to grieve openly. A teenage girl across the table wiped her nose with the sleeve of her hoodie. She looked around nervously before whispering, "I keep thinking about my dog. We couldn't find him when we left. I don't even know if he made it." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her hand against her face, ashamed of her tears. Keanu turned toward her, his expression soft. "That matters too," he said. "He's part of your family,
It's not silly to miss him. It's love." The girl lowered her hand, surprised, her eyes brimming. No one had told her that before. She nodded slowly, letting herself cry without hiding this time. The weight she had carried alone was suddenly lighter, shared by those who listened. Other voices followed. A man in his 60s talked about the truck he had rebuilt piece by piece over decades, only to watch it burn in his driveway. A young mother described the moment she realized she had left behind her wedding album, her words trembling as she admitted she might never see the photographs again. Each story was different, yet every one carried the same thread of loss and the same desperate need to be heard. Keanu didn't interrupt or try to fix what couldn't be fixed. He nodded. He murmured words of understanding, and when silence hung heavy, he let it stay until the person was ready to continue. He listened as though every story mattered, because to the person speaking, it did, and in the act of being heard, something shifted. The survivors' shoulders eased, their voices grew steadier, and for the first time, they realized they weren't carrying their pain alone. The circle of voices widened as more survivors found the courage to speak. A retired teacher described the helplessness of leaving behind shelves of books she had collected over a lifetime, her voice breaking as she confessed she felt she had abandoned her students by not being able to save their projects. A young boy admitted that he missed the swing set in his backyard, his words simple but carrying the same weight as the larger losses. Every story, whether small or immense, was treated with the same respect. Keanu listened to each one without distraction. When the teacher spoke, he told her softly that her students would remember her kindness more than the projects. When the boy spoke of his swing, Keanu smiled gently and said that sometimes the smallest things were what made a home feel real. These simple responses carried weight because they were not empty. They acknowledged the truth without trying to diminish the pain. The gym grew quieter as the night deepened, but the stories continued. People who had once avoided talking now leaned forward, eager to share. They realized they weren't just telling Keanu their stories, they were telling each other. Every nod of understanding, every hand that reached across the table, every tear that fell made the camp feel less like a shelter and more like a family. Even the sarcastic volunteer, who had avoided speaking for days, finally lifted his head. His voice was rough, heavy with shame. "I said something cruel when you first got here," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I didn't believe you were here for us. But last night proved me wrong." His words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Keanu only nodded, not demanding apology, only accepting the honesty for what it was. The man exhaled, his shoulders sagging, as though confessing had set him free. By the time the last story was shared, the gym felt transformed. The survivors were still weary, still uncertain of the future, but they no longer felt invisible. They had spoken their grief aloud, and someone had listened. The act itself was healing. As the group dispersed for the night, parents tucked their children into cots, whispering the refrain of the song from the night before. The farmer rested his hands on the table, calmer now, his loss no less heavy but no longer carried alone. The teenage girl whispered a quiet thank you before slipping back to her corner. Keanu remained seated, his gaze lingering on the people around him. He hadn't given speeches, hadn't drawn attention to himself. He had only listened. But in that listening, he had given something greater than answers. He had given dignity to voices that the fire had nearly silenced. That evening, the camp settled into its fragile rhythm once more. Families were preparing to resettle, rest. Children were being tucked into makeshift beds, and volunteers were finishing their rounds when the hum of the generator stuttered. The overhead lights flickered violently, buzzing for a moment before fading into darkness. A collective sigh rippled through the gym. Parents tightened their arms around their children, and whispers of unease spread quickly. Without the lights, the smoke outside pressed closer, the shadows inside lengthened, and the sense of vulnerability returned. People had grown used to the faint, artificial brightness, and now its sudden absence felt like the fire itself had crept back in. The coordinator hurried forward, trying to calm the room. "It's all right," she said softly. "We'll manage."
Volunteers began moving quickly, opening supply boxes where emergency candles had been stored. Their hands worked quickly in the dim light, fumbling for matches. From the corner, Keanu stepped forward. He accepted a small box of matches from a volunteer and took a single candle in his other hand. The gym was so silent in that moment that the scratch of the match striking was as loud as a spark in the night. The tiny flame flared, glowing against the dark. Keanu held the candle steady until the wick caught fire, then lifted it slightly so others could see. The faces nearest to him reflected the soft light, their eyes wide, their tension easing as the first glow reached them. He turned toward the nearest family, a mother and her 2 children, and gently tipped the flame to their candle. The mother's hands trembled as the wick lit, but when it did, her children gasped softly, mesmerized by the glow. She passed the flame to the family beside her, and then that family passed it further. One by one, candles were lit across the gym. The darkness receded slowly, not with the harsh hum of fluorescent bulbs, but with warm circles of light. Shadows danced against the walls, flickering with every breath of air. But the sight was strangely comforting. Parents guided their children's hands to hold the candles carefully, teaching them respect for the tiny flames. Teenagers carried them proudly, raising them a little higher so their neighbors could see. Volunteers moved through the crowd, helping those whose candles sputtered before catching. The glow spread, fragile but unstoppable, until the entire gym shimmered like a sea of stars. In that light, the fear that had crept in when the power failed dissolved. The fire outside might still rage, but inside the camp, there was another fire, now one of unity, of presence, of hope. The soft glow of hundreds of small flames transformed the gym. What had been a place of shadows and unease only moments before now pulsed with quiet warmth. Children stared wide-eyed at the candles, their faces illuminated in amber halos. Parents exhaled slowly, as though the light itself released the tension locked inside their chests. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was reverent. Keanu stood near the center, his own candle steady in his hand. He didn't lift it high, didn't make a speech, didn't draw attention to himself. Instead, he watched the light spread from person to person. Each flame passed carefully, as if it carried more than wax and wick. It carried a message: you are not alone. A boy in the front row whispered to his sister, "It looks like the stars came back." She nodded, clutching her candle tightly, her reflection dancing in her wide eyes. Their mother leaned down, pressing a kiss into their hair, whispering, "It's the most beautiful thing I've seen since the fire." Around the room, the same thought stirred in different ways. A farmer who had lost his land lifted his candle slightly, as though offering it in memory of everything he had built. The teenager who had cried over her missing dog whispered his name to the flame, letting her grief flicker into the light instead of hiding it. Each person gave their own silent meaning to the candle, and together those meanings formed a tapestry stronger than any speech could weave. Volunteers walked through the aisles, their faces shining with renewed energy. They had spent days carrying boxes, arguing over logistics, collapsing into exhaustion. Now, they moved slowly, reverently, as though the candles reminded them why they kept working. The bikers who had delivered supplies stood along the back wall, their broad shoulders softened by the glow, nodding quietly to one another as if even they felt the sacredness of the moment. The sarcastic volunteer who had mocked Keanu at the start held his candle lower than the rest. His lips were pressed tight, his eyes glistening as he stared at the flame. Shame and gratitude battled across his face, but for once he stayed silent. His silence was not resistance this time, it was humility. Keanu lowered himself to sit on the floor, cross-legged like he had the night before with his guitar. Families followed his lead, some sitting, some kneeling, until the room felt like a single circle around the constellation of flames. No one spoke loudly. Some whispered prayers. Others hummed fragments of the lullaby they had sung the night before. The combination of flickering light and soft sound created a sense of unity that no power outage could break. A little girl raised her candle higher than her head, her arm shaking but determined. She smiled shyly at those around her, and soon other children did the same.
Soon dozens of tiny arms stretched upward, lifting the light into the air. The ceiling glowed with reflections of firelight, shadows dancing like waves above them. Parents began to weep quietly, not with despair but with release. They had been holding so much, too much. But in that moment, the burden was shared across 100 flames. The camp had been stripped of electricity, but it had not been left in darkness. It had found its own light. When the candles finally burned low, volunteers moved carefully to collect them, whispering reminders about safety. Yet no one felt the loss when the flames went out. The memory of the glow lingered, imprinted on their hearts. Even in the quiet that followed, it was as if the fire still lived within them, not a fire of destruction, but of hope. The candles had long since burned out, but the memory of their glow lingered in the gym. Families slept in a rare peace, their breathing steady, their children finally still. Volunteers cleaned quietly along the edges, their voices hushed, unwilling to disturb the fragile calm. Near the supply tables, the sarcastic volunteer lingered, his vest stained with ash and sweat. For days he had worked without pause, carrying boxes, directing people, and trying to keep order. Yet all the while, bitterness had clung to him, feeding his doubts about the man in the cap and plain boots who had appeared without explanation. He had been the one to sneer, the one to say the words everyone else had been too polite to voice. Now those words weighed on him like stones. He had seen Keanu carry crates until his hands were raw. He had seen him divide the gym into zones to restore fairness. He had seen him call the bikers who delivered salvation when the shelves ran bare. And he had watched him sit cross-legged with children, strumming them to sleep when fear kept them awake. None of it fit the picture of a celebrity chasing headlines. The volunteer rubbed his face with both hands, ashamed. He could no longer keep the guilt to himself. He walked slowly toward the far side of the gym, where Keanu was folding blankets left behind on empty cots. Keanu looked up as he approached. His expression was the same as always, calm, steady, unassuming. He didn't flinch, didn't brace himself, simply waited. The volunteer stopped a few feet away, his throat tight. For a moment, the words refused to come. Finally, he swallowed hard and said, "I owe you an apology." Keanu tilted his head slightly, silent but attentive. "I was the one who said those things," the man admitted, his voice breaking. "When you first came in, about charity photos, about how you didn't belong here, I thought you were here to be seen, not to help." The words spilled out faster now, heavy with shame. "I assumed the worst. I didn't even give you a chance. And then I watched you. I watched you do everything I wasn't willing to believe. You carried boxes until your arms shook. You fixed the supply mess without ordering anyone around. You even gave up the spotlight when the reporter came. And last night, those kids fell asleep because of you. My own niece hasn't slept like that since the fire started, and I mocked you." His chest heaved, as though the confession had cost him something enormous. He shook his head, his eyes wet. "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Keanu set the blanket down carefully and stepped closer. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, firm but gentle. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of grace. "We all assume too quickly sometimes," he said. "What matters is what we do now." The volunteer closed his eyes, the words cutting straight through his shame. His body shook, and before he could stop himself, he broke down. His sobs came rough, unpolished, the release of guilt that had sat too long. He covered his face with his hands, whispering through tears, "Thank you. Thank you for not hating me for it." Keanu didn't let go. He stood steady, his hand still on the man's shoulder, anchoring him as he wept. The volunteer's sobs slowly eased, though his shoulders still shook. He lowered his hands, embarrassed by the tears streaking his ash-stained face. "I don't deserve your kindness," he muttered, his voice raw. "I've been angry at everything at the fire, at losing my home, at having to sleep in a gym. I took it out on you because you were the easiest target. You didn't deserve that." Keanu shook his head lightly, his expression unchanged. "None of us are at our best when we're hurting," he replied. Pain makes us lash out. You're not the only one." His words were not meant to excuse, but to release. They gave the man room to breathe again. The volunteer drew, in a shaky breath, his guilt still heavy. "But you could have said something back. You could have called me out in front of everyone. Instead, you just kept helping. That's what broke me. You never stopped. You proved me wrong without saying a word." He let out a bitter laugh that turned quickly into another tear. "I'll never forget that." Keanu squeezed his shoulder once before, letting his hand drop. "Then let's move forward," he said quietly. "What matters isn't the mistake. It's what we choose to do after." The man nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. His chest still heaved, but the weight had shifted. It was no longer shame alone, it was the beginning of freedom. He whispered again, this time steadier, "Thank you." For a long moment, the two men stood there in the dimly lit corner of the gym. Around them, the quiet murmur of the shelter continued, parents whispering to children, volunteers stacking supplies. But here, it felt like time had paused. A wound had been named, and in naming it, it had begun to heal. The volunteer finally straightened, his voice firm, though still fragile. "If you'll let me, I want to help more, not just moving boxes. I want to be there, the way you've been there." Keanu gave a small nod. "Then you already have." The man blinked, confused. "By choosing differently now," Keanu added, "by admitting the truth and stepping forward, that's the start of helping." Tears welled again, but this time they were not born of shame. They were born of gratitude. The volunteer extended his hand, hesitant but sincere. Keanu clasped it firmly, holding it for a moment longer than a handshake required. It wasn't a transaction, it was a bond. When the man finally stepped back, his shoulders seemed lighter. He returned to the tables where other volunteers were working, his movements more purposeful than before. Those who saw him noticed the change, but didn't question it. They simply welcomed him back into the rhythm of service. Across the gym, a mother who had witnessed the exchange whispered to her neighbor, "Something just shifted." Her neighbor nodded, her eyes following the man who had once been the loudest critic and was now quietly hauling blankets with renewed strength. The apology hadn't just healed him, it had rippled outward, showing others that even in the ashes, redemption was possible. And for a camp that had lived with so much loss, that reminder was as valuable as food or firelight. The morning after the candlelight moment arrived quietly, but something in the air felt different. The smoke outside still lingered, the walls of the gym were still streaked with ash, and the cots remained crowded. Yet the heaviness that had clung to the camp seemed to have lifted. Conversations began early, not with complaints or whispers of despair, but with voices carrying traces of warmth. Families gathered around the breakfast tables, sharing food more freely than before. A father split his oatmeal packet in half to give to the family beside him. A mother offered an extra juice box to a child who had none. Small gestures, but each one built on the spirit that had been sparked the night before. The children, who had been restless and fearful for so many nights, now moved easily among the cots. Some played games with each other, their laughter bouncing across the room like a melody. Others sat in small groups, humming bits of the song they had learned, their voices weaving together fragments of hope. Parents who had once sat silent now watched with softer expressions, no longer gripped by constant worry. Volunteers noticed the change too. They had grown used to raised voices, to arguments over supplies, to the endless stress of trying to keep order in chaos. But this morning was different. Families lined up without pushing. People offered to help carry boxes, instead of waiting for them to be delivered. Even when the generator sputtered. Again, no one panicked. They had learned to steady themselves in the glow of one another's presence. Keanu stayed in the background as always. He swept the corners of the gym, stacked more chairs, and carried trays where they were needed. Yet he could feel it as clearly as anyone else. The camp had shifted. His guitar, the candles, the quiet acts of service, they had rippled outward until the entire shelter seemed to move with a new rhythm. A farmer who had spoken the night before leaned on his table, watching the children play. He whispered to another man beside him, Last night changed us. It wasn't just the music or the candles. It was all of it. The night the camp became a community. The man nodded, his face grave, but softened. I've been through storms before, but I've never seen people hold each other up like this. Even the weary coordinators, who had spent endless days running on adrenaline, noticed the transformation. One of them paused near the supply table, her arms crossed as she surveyed the room. I've worked shelters for years, she said to her colleague, but I've never seen evacuees this united. Usually, by this point, people are angry, tired, ready to turn on each other. But look at them. She gestured toward a group of parents sharing food while their children played nearby. Something's different. Her colleague nodded. They stopped being just evacuees. They became neighbors again. The words rang true. In a gym filled with strangers who had lost everything, bonds were forming. Quietly, steadily, the people were remembering what it meant to belong to one another. As the day unfolded, the change grew even more visible. Families who had kept to themselves began pulling their cots closer, creating small clusters where conversations flowed. Mothers compared notes on how to keep their children calm. Fathers shared advice about rebuilding, swapping phone numbers on scraps of paper so they could stay connected. After the camp closed, what had once been isolation was now fellowship. Meals became gatherings rather than survival. People passed food down the rows, making sure no one was left out. When a boy dropped his bread on the dusty floor, another child immediately split his piece in half and handed it over without hesitation. The boy's mother tried to refuse, but the other child's father simply said, "We all share now." That phrase carried through the gym, repeated like a motto. Volunteers moved more easily too, buoyed by the cooperative spirit around them. They no longer had to enforce order or repeat instructions. Families organized themselves, keeping lines neat and helping the elderly or disabled move forward without waiting to be asked. The coordinators, who had dreaded every mealtime, found themselves watching in quiet disbelief. One coordinator leaned against the wall, exhaustion etched into her features, and murmured, "I've never seen it like this. It's not just order, it's harmony." Another nodded beside her. "It feels like they've remembered they're stronger together." Children carried the lightest proof of the change. They no longer clung to their parents with fear in their eyes. Instead, they skipped between cots, giggling as they taught each other hand games. At night, when the generator buzzed uncertainly, they whispered the lullaby they had learned, their voices soothing even the adults who listened nearby. Keanu remained a quiet figure in the background, moving chairs, sweeping, carrying supplies. Yet everywhere he went, he saw the evidence of what had blossomed. A mother braided another woman's hair while their children played together. A teenager who had once wept over her missing dog now sat teaching smaller kids a clapping game. The farmer who had lost his land helped mend a broken cot for a stranger, his grief softened by purpose. And always, the whispers followed. Last night was when it changed. That was the dawn. Night the camp became a community. The phrase took root, repeated with certainty, as though it was already part of their shared history. By evening, the coordinators admitted it openly. Sitting at a table covered in paperwork and half-empty coffee cups, one said, "We've seen miracles of survival in these camps before, but never a transformation like this. They should have fallen apart by now. Instead, they're closer than I've ever seen." The other coordinator looked toward the man in the plain cap, who was quietly stacking boxes against the far wall. "Maybe because someone reminded them what it means to be human," she said. The words carried, even if softly spoken. In that gym full of survivors, the truth was undeniable. The music, the order, the candles, every act had become more than a moment. They had become a movement, one that reshaped despair into unity. And so the camp, once just a place to endure, became a place to belong. The camp had grown into a rhythm of its own. Days passed with routines of meals, chores, and small acts of kindness. Children no longer asked when they could go home. They had found comfort in each other, in the songs, in the soft glow of community. Volunteers no longer braced for conflict. Instead, they watched families share food, laughter, and stories with an ease that surprised even the most seasoned coordinators. Keanu remained a constant, never stepping into the spotlight, always moving quietly among the people. He swept ash from the corners, stacked boxes when supplies arrived, played his guitar when children grew restless, and offered calm when the air grew tense. He never asked for thanks. He never stayed in one place long enough to let it settle on him. But dawn came one morning with a different stillness. The sky outside the gym was pale, the smoke rising in faint streaks as the fires that had devastated the valley finally waned. Inside, the family still slept, curled beneath their blankets, their children pressed close. The volunteers, worn thin but steadied by the unity that had formed, dozed in chairs or leaned against the walls. Keanu rose quietly, careful not to disturb anyone. He moved through the gym with the same deliberate calm he had shown every day, but this time his steps carried the weight of farewell. At the supply table, he set down a small piece of paper, folded neatly beside a single guitar pick, its edges worn smooth from years of use. The note was short, written in a hand that was simple, unadorned. For the kids, keep singing. He placed the pick on top of the paper so it would not drift away. Then he stepped back, letting his eyes rest on the site of the gym one last time. The rows of cots, the soft breathing of children, the faint smell of smoke mixed with wax from the candles they had held, it was all etched into his memory now. He didn't wake anyone. He didn't announce his departure. He pulled his cap lower on his head, adjusted the strap of his worn duffel bag, and slipped through the doors into the pale light of dawn. The door shut softly behind him, leaving the gym unchanged, yet profoundly altered. His presence had settled into the very walls, into the memories of those who had lived through these days with him. Though his footsteps faded quickly outside, what he had left behind could not be erased. When the survivors awoke hours later, they found the gym as they had left it, except for the note and the small guitar pick resting on the table. At first, it was the children who noticed. One boy picked it up carefully, holding it like a treasure, his eyes wide as he read the words aloud. For the kids, keep singing. Parents gathered around, their expressions shifting from surprise to understanding. They realized at once that he was gone, and yet the silence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like a blessing left behind. The discovery of the note spread quickly through the camp. Parents gathered near the supply table, reading the simple message again and again as if to make sure it was real. The guitar pick passed from hand to hand, each person holding it carefully, reverently, before returning it to the table. It was not just an object, it was a reminder of what they had lived through together. Children clustered closest, their eyes wide with disappointment and awe. One girl whispered, "He left it for us. That means we can still sing, even if he's not here." Another boy nodded, clutching the pick in his fist before handing it back to the volunteer who had once mocked Keanu. The man's hands trembled as he held it, his earlier shame now deepened by the knowledge that Keanu had left quietly, without demanding forgiveness, without asking for recognition. Whispers moved through the gym. "He's gone. He left before we could thank him." But then another voice, softer yet stronger, rose above the rest. "He gave us more than supplies. He gave us back our dignity." The words settled over the room like truth carved into stone. The coordinators who had struggled to hold the camp together during the hardest days found themselves speechless. They had never seen an evacuation site transformed like this. They watched families comforting one another, sharing their food, humming bits of songs, and realized it wasn't just survival anymore. It was community. Keanu's presence had set the spark, but it was the people who had carried it forward. Throughout the morning, survivors spoke of him in quiet conversations. A farmer told his neighbor how Keanu had listened to his grief without judgment. A teenager repeated the words he had said about her missing dog, remembering how it had made her feel seen. A young mother cradled her child and whispered about the night her baby had finally slept through to morning because of the lullaby. Each story added to the collective understanding. He had given them back pieces of themselves they thought the fire had taken forever. By noon, the guitar pick had been placed in a small wooden box one of the bikers donated. It was set on a table near the center of the gym, where anyone could see it. Families walked by and touched it gently, treating it like a symbol of hope. Some children even sang softly as they passed, their voices carrying the refrain that had once filled the room with light. The sarcastic volunteer stood nearby, watching in silence. His earlier bitterness felt like a lifetime ago. He whispered to a fellow worker, "I judged him wrong. He didn't just change the camp, he changed me." The worker clapped his shoulder, nodding in agreement. By evening, the camp was alive with stories and quiet songs, none of which required his presence to continue. Though Keanu had walked out before dawn, his spirit lingered in every whispered thank you, in every shared meal, in every hand that reached out to another. And as the survivors settled for the night, the words of the mother echoed once more, carried from cot to cot. "He gave us back our dignity." In the days that followed, people inside the camp continued to whisper about him. Not because he was a celebrity, not because of the films they had once seen him in, but because of the quiet way he had stood among them. They remembered the guitar chords drifting into the night, the candles glowing like stars when the lights went out, the gentle way he spoke to a teenager about her missing dog, and the steady patience with which he listened to their grief. It wasn't fame that left the deepest mark on the shelter. It wasn't the recognition of a well-known face. It was the humility of a man who swept floors, taped lines on a gymnasium floor, and passed a flame from one candle to another. In a place where despair had spread like smoke, he gave something different presence. The kind of presence that asked for nothing, demanded no spotlight, and gave without measure. The survivors carried that memory with them as they prepared to rebuild their lives. One mother repeated often to anyone who would listen, "He gave us more than supplies. He gave us back our dignity." Her words became a refrain, repeated by others until it grew into a truth the whole camp shared. Dignity had been restored not by speeches or cameras, but by small acts of kindness that proved their lives still mattered. When volunteers gathered at the end of their shifts, they spoke of the transformation they had witnessed. They marveled at how families had begun to share food instead of hoard it, how children had found laughter again, how strangers had become neighbors. They admitted they had never seen an evacuation site so calm, so united, so full of hope. And always, their eyes drifted toward the empty space where he had once slept, the folded blankets, the table with the guitar pick and note. The coordinators, hardened by years of disaster relief, found themselves speaking differently too. One of them confessed quietly, "I thought we were just holding this place together with tape and luck, but now it feels like we've been part of something sacred." That night, the music, the light, the way people opened up, I'll remember that for the rest of my life. Even the volunteer who had once mocked him carried the memory differently. He no longer walked with the bitterness that had marked him before. His words were fewer, his service steadier, his shoulders lighter. When asked what had changed him, he simply pointed to the guitar pick and said, "That man taught me what real service looks like." The Wildfire camp, once only a shelter for the displaced, became a story of its own. Families who moved on told their relatives, their friends, their communities about what had happened there. They described it as the night the camp became a community, the night dignity returned, the night hope outshone the fire. And in every retelling, one truth remained. It wasn't wealth or recognition that had carried them through. It was the sound of a guitar, the glow of a candle, and the presence of a man who chose to stand with them when it mattered most. Long after the smoke cleared from the valley, the story of that camp continued to be told. Survivors carried it with them as they resettled, as they rebuilt, as they tried to make sense of lives reshaped by fire. They spoke of the nights when fear ruled the gym, when supplies ran thin, when tempers frayed and despair settled heavy over every cot. And then they spoke of the turning point. The night music filled the air. The night candles lit the darkness. The night a fractured shelter became a family again. It was not a night of speeches or dramatic gestures. It was a night of presence. A man in worn jeans and a cap pulled low had chosen not to stand apart, but to kneel with the children, to carry boxes with the volunteers, to hand the microphone to a mother who thought no one cared about her story. His silence had been louder than words, and his humility had been more powerful than any headline. People remembered how he had left quietly, before dawn, slipping away without ceremony. He had left no speeches, no photographs, no press release, only a guitar pick and a note that read, "For the kids." keep singing. Those simple words lived on, passed down through families, repeated at gatherings, etched into memory as a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope could be carried in a song. The coordinators later reflected that they had never seen anything like it. Camps usually frayed over time, the strain of loss eating away at patience and trust. But this one had been different. Families left stronger than they had arrived. They carried not just supplies, but a sense of dignity, a conviction that they had been seen, heard, and valued. "We thought we were keeping them alive," one coordinator admitted. "But in truth, they reminded us what it means to live." And so, the legacy of that quiet night stretched far beyond the walls of the gym. It became a story that outlived the smoke. Not a story of fame or fortune, but a story of what presence, humility, and music can do when the world feels broken. Final reflection. When the world burns down, sometimes all it takes is one song to remind us we're still alive. Now I want to ask you, would you have the courage to stand and serve when others doubt your intentions? Would you have the patience to listen, the humility to step back, the strength to carry boxes in silence, and the grace to give the spotlight to someone else? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that remind us of the power of kindness, humility, and hope.